We'll be giving us a talk today, so we're just asking a few questions to get to know a bit about you. Tell us a bit about yourself and what your actual stats were when you started here.
Okay, oh my gosh, I don't want to know stats. So my name is Alanzo, I'm from Canada, and I did my undergrad here at Wycliffe. Paul was my college. I studied theology and then continued asking big questions because I'm really curious. With a master's degree back in Canada at the University of Toronto, where I did theology and mixed it with some philosophy, metaphysics specifically. And then hopefully, I was just telling somebody, I just finished my proposal for a DPhil, so pray for me as I submit that. Have my supervisor actually, I'm not crazy, for thinking what I think. So yeah, that's what I do.
Lovely. So I'm just going to be giving us a talk today on why does the love of God allow suffering and injustice. So I'll let him take it.
Awesome, thank you. Well, thank you so much everyone for coming. If you don't usually come, gosh, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. Let me just tell you a little bit about my story before we dive into this big question. So I did not grow up in a Christian home. It was nominally Catholic at the very best. So we'd go to, church on Christmas or Easter, like just in case there was a big guy up there, then maybe Judgment Day would go over a little bit better because we put in a little bit of time at least. So it was more like fire insurance than anything else. But I did not understand who Jesus was or what the cross meant, what the resurrection meant, or anything like that. And then when I was 12 years old, my parents got divorced. And if you know what that's like, it's horrible. It's horrible. It shattered us. So I tried to find a coping mechanism as a result. And the coping mechanism for me was drugs. I just fell into the wrong crew at the wrong time. And started smoking weed and drinking and living that sort of life. By the time I was 18, I was a full-blown opiates addict. So it's like a heroin-type drug, oxycontin, Percocets, morphine, that sort of thing. And just got into a worse and worse lifestyle. I opened up a hip-hop clothing store with a group of dudes, and it was a front for selling crack cocaine. And these group of dudes were not your Bible study kind of guys. They had all spent time in prison, all carried guns, that sort of thing. And I was so addicted to drugs that I needed to be around these guys and help out with the business. And so I just got myself into a lot of trouble. It all sort of climaxed this one evening after a reggae night. So my background's Caribbean. My mom is white, my dad is from Guyana. And after this reggae night, I went to a friend's house, and this friend, during the course of the evening, we had quite the cocktail of drugs. And whatever we were taking caused this guy to have a drug-induced schizophrenic episode, which means that he was hearing these voices, and these voices told him to chop my head off while I was sleeping. And so as I was sleeping on the couch, he went and got a blade, and as I was sleeping like this, he proceeded to swing. And by God's grace, this is part of my story, I don't know how else to explain it, but by some miracle, I think this was a miracle from Jesus, but by some miracle, he ended up hitting me on this bone back here. It gave me about 8 stitches on this bone back here rather than my neck, so I was about 1 inch away from actually being murdered, 1 inch away from not being able to come and speak to you guys here today. And so it was shortly thereafter that my sister actually invited me to come to church. She had just recently become a Christian. And I went to this church reluctantly, but it's where I heard about Jesus properly for the very first time. And I instantly fell in love. I wanted to know more about this person, Jesus. I had made a mess of my life, and it looked like here was some potential hope. And that's what really got me, and what got me on this course of thinking about big questions. So, without any further ado, let's dive into today's topic. Now we have 25 minutes or so, and let me start by acknowledging 2 things at the beginning. Number 1 is that for many of us, suffering is no theoretical discussion. It is a felt reality. And if you're somebody here today who has gone through suffering, or is suffering right now, I just wanted to start by saying, I am so sorry for what you're going through. And you might object already and say, Zoman, you have 0 clue about what I'm going through in my suffering. You know what? You're absolutely right. I wouldn't try to insult you by saying that I fully comprehend your particular experience of suffering. I just want you to interpret this talk as a very first step in your journey as you're going through it. And please do ask for help. I always, whenever I speak on this, if we go to the next slide, I always say to people, it is okay to ask for help. I needed to go through help. I'm going to share a little bit about my story later on, but everybody could use a little bit of help, I think, when you're going through suffering, and it is okay to do that. No shame in your game. Next, I want to say the following. I want to be sensitive to the heartbreaking fact that some people haven't just suffered in general, but have been hurt or abused by Christians, by the church. I was speaking in London a few years ago, and a young dude came up to me. He was 15 years old. I was giving a very similar talk, and this dude comes up to me and says, my mom recently passed away from cancer. She was diagnosed a few years ago and succumbed to it. And he said, man, I went to the church and I was looking for answers. And my question was really simple. Why? Why would God allow such a thing to happen to me? And I said, well, what did they say? And I'll never forget how they responded to him. They said this, quote, the reason your mom died of cancer was because you had more faith in your mom than in God. Let's not mince words. That is not spiritual. That is not biblical. That is not what Jesus would say. That is emotional, spiritual abuse, and that's wrong. Full stop, no excuses. And if you're somebody that has experienced that nonsense, please hear me when I say, I'm so sorry that you were told something like that, or some variation of it. I'm so sorry. It was not right. And this naturally brings us to the question at hand today. The pain is real. The suffering is real. The injustice is real. The trauma is real. But is God? And here I just want to say a bit of a trigger warning. The content will be a bit heavy during this talk. And I want to be very sensitive to anyone that's sitting here today. I don't want to afflict you with any of the content, so I just want to give you a chance. I will tell you when things come up that might be a bit triggering for you. I'll ask you just to close your eyes, and then I'll tell you, we'll flip to the next slide and that sort of thing. So, because I want to be sensitive to wherever you're at. The next slide is going to be one of those potentially triggering slides, because it's going to be a picture of a compilation of suffering from a variety of different backgrounds. So if that's you, I'm going to ask the slide to go on at the count of 3. Feel free to close your eyes, and then I'll tell you when it's passed. So on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. So when we're talking about, is God real in light of the suffering? I mean, just think about it. Just think about it. The war between Israel and Hamas, the war in Ukraine, human trafficking, racial injustice like George Floyd, slavery, poverty, all sorts of abuse, especially towards women and girls, world wars, including atrocities like the Holocaust. And we can all feel this even more when we think of specific examples. So we can go to the next slide. If you close your eyes, you can open them now. Some years ago when I was in Toronto working there, during that time in our office we had this beautiful art exhibit from an Indian humanitarian organization called Agni Raksha, and it was entitled Beautiful, and what it was women that were victims of the horrific practice of bride burning. So essentially, and this happens to thousands of women every single year in particular parts of the world, they are victims of some sort of domestic violence act, or they can't pay marriage dowry. And this, in some of these contexts, or the consequence. So some will have acid thrown on them, and that would be disfiguring, much like that. And then others will have kerosene actually doused over them, and the upset family will light up a match and burn them. It's absolutely horrific. And what this humanitarian organization is doing, as we're partnering with them, is trying to raise awareness for these women and trying to fund some of the reconstructive surgery and stuff like that and help change some of the laws over there. And what makes matters worse is that the legal system in some of these countries, far too often, the perpetrators never face justice. Never face justice. Some of them pay the police while others run away. And many of these women are either too poor or too frightened to pursue justice. Understandably so. Understandably so. And so again, when we think about some of these stories, the question just screams out at us. Why on earth would a loving God allow such atrocities? Now, I'm going to show you some of my favorite philosophers next. Kendrick Lamar on the weekend. On the next slide, raise your hand if you ever heard these guys before. So you guys, yeah, okay, great. Just one thing. They're at the height of the academy, and they write in their song, "Pray for me. Tell me who's going to save me from this. Tell me who's going to pray for me. Take my pain from me. Save my soul from me. So I'm all alone, you see." And whether you believe in God or not, everyone collides with these questions. This reality, this problem, the problem of suffering. And as many of you already know, the problem of suffering is used by some in our culture to argue against the existence of God. And the big idea here is this, if we go to the next slide, that it is impossible for God and suffering to coexist. And let's say that suffering is a catch-all phrase, including things like evil and injustice. And the argument looks like this. If God, this is the logical problem of evil or the logical problem of suffering, if God is all-powerful and all-loving, then he wouldn't allow suffering. Suffering exists, obviously. Therefore, God must not exist. And here's why. If we go to the next slide. Here's why. Since God is all-powerful, then he should be powerful enough to stop suffering. And since God is all-powerful, or all-loving, then he should be loving enough to want to stop it. And speaking honestly, Alanzo here, I think someone truly hurting, I think it is so understandable that you would come to that conclusion. Absolutely. I just want to affirm you in that. But as we explore the question, have we ever thought, what happens if the argument is true? If this problem is true? What does it mean exactly if God doesn't exist? Would God not existing solve the problem? And the answer from my perspective is no. God not existing doesn't resolve as much as someone might hope, because we're still faced with the existence, the reality of suffering and injustice and evil in our world. And that is a very critical first point to realize. And with all due respect, I personally think that God not existing actually makes things worse. How so? I'm so glad you asked. If the problem of suffering is true, then I think that naturalist writers like Richard Dawkins from this university, I have written here from the University of Oxford, but we're here in Oxford, so that's cool. Anyways, I digress. The next slide here. This is me with your boy, Richard Dawkins. Then Sainsbury. I just love the use of often short shorts too. Awesome. Anyways. He writes this in one of his books. Quote, "In a universe of blind physical forces, at bottom there is no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." No evil. Just think about that for a moment. Think about the horrors of the bride burning I spoke of earlier, or human trafficking, or bullying, or racism. Deep on the inside, we protest such evils as absolute evils. They're unjust, and it's not unjust and evil as a matter of opinion, like how you should have jam before the cream. You know what I'm saying? Or maybe this is a cream before the jam sort of thing. I'm a Canadian, so forgive me. I'm just, just commenting on the debate. But it's not like that. We want to say it's a matter of fact that things like bullying and racism and human trafficking, etc., are evil. And there's something deep on the inside further that rebels against the ideas like Susan Blackmore, who said in an interview about the tragedies of our world, in the next slide, my response is nothing matters. It's all empty and meaningless. This is just the way the world is. Get used to it. And so can you imagine how dehumanizing it is to, say, a survivor of Auschwitz, to hear it's all empty and meaningless, that sort of nihilistic rhetoric. Or how devaluing nothing matters actually is. Or how decomforting it is when someone is forced to, quote, get used to it, because there is no hope of ultimate justice. Now, here's my point. Yes, an Auschwitz survivor, let's say, has difficult questions for God, no doubt. But I think that there are even more difficult questions that arise if God doesn't exist. So we've just defined the problem, we've explored what happens if it's true. Now we have to ask, is the problem true? Now, in the philosophy of religion literature, the problem as I presented it to you is considered a defeated problem. And by that they mean that both atheist and theist thinkers agree that the problem as I presented it is not as sound an argument as once believed. And the way that they defeated it was by identifying what philosophers will call hidden assumptions within the premises of the actual argument itself. So I put up here a couple of examples, but I don't want to take up too much time because I want to get somewhere and I'm really interested in hearing your questions. But they will just identify things like, since God is all-powerful, then he can just create any sort of world that he wants to create, one that would include no evil and suffering and so on. And then there's a teleological response. Well, it just depends on the purpose of God's creation and what his aims are. In the biblical view, the Christian worldview's response to that is, well, God's after love. So if you have love, then you need freedom. And if you have freedom, then that entails that there's a possibility of evil and injustice and suffering to follow. Next is another hidden assumption. Well, is it impossible for a all-loving God to have it is impossible for a all-loving God to have a morally sufficient reason, a good reason for allowing suffering. And then there's an epistemological response to that, having to do with the way that we think. The problem with that statement is that it is a position that's impossible to defend. So how can one claim to know in the technical sense of know, that God doesn't have a morally sufficient or good sort of reason for allowing the things that he does? He could have one reason, or lots of reasons, a trillion reasons, or whatever. It's impossible to say that he doesn't. Now, there's lots of possible reasons. I've actually just added a few more on the next slide of just some popular theodicies and defenses that philosophers and theologians and even the Bible have presented. One being, it's internally coherent within the worldview that suffering and evil exists, again, because of that teleological response of God has a particular purpose for his world. Others have offered things like soul-making theodicy, and we can get into that afterwards, and also skeptical theism, which is a very poorly labeled response to this problem. It basically means that it's possible that God has some sort of morally sufficient reason, but due to our limited cognitive faculties, it might be the case that we just don't have the cognitive capabilities to fully comprehend why God would allow such things. So a real simple example of this is, suppose you're a parent and you bring your little one to the dentist because, I don't know, if there's something wrong with their tooth or something, and they just can't grasp the fact that you would usher them into this chair and they'd have to undergo this torture of getting this, cavity filled or whatever. And even though they don't understand it, it is a morally sufficient reason for bringing the child there because there's some sort of long-term good that would be a result. Okay, so next, carrying on. Here is my point. Here's my point. That it is logically possible for God and suffering and evil and injustice to coexist. And by identifying these hidden assumptions, we discover where exactly the argument's just not true. And if the logic of the argument can be shown to be mistaken, then it isn't as valid an argument as we may have thought initially, even though we still feel it existentially. But if the argument doesn't work against the existence of God, my gentle sort of suggestion would be like, well, then why hold it? Even though we existentially, and I'm going to respond to that in just a moment. It's my view, therefore, that the honest next move is to either look for a different argument or become open to the fact that you may need to change your view here. Now, next, if God does exist, okay, so let's just say it's a given. Okay, so one of these theodicies works, let's say. Now, if God does exist, the next logical or natural question is, where is he in a world that's full of suffering? As Eleanor Stumpf would say, the really famous philosopher from the US, the earth is soaked with the tears of those who have suffered. And we need to approach this with reverence, and I hope you get my heart on that. So where is he in this? What does Christianity have to say? Well, it says quite a bit. If we go to the next slide here, you'll see, according to the Christian worldview, the biblical account of things, God's initial intention and reign is one of goodness and beauty and truth and love and justice and life. However, human rebellion ushers in an epoch of evil and ugliness and falsehood and hate and injustice and death. So within the biblical worldview, there's a coherent accounting of all of these things theologically. But even if that theological accounting holds, I think we're all still wondering, where is he? Next, I'm just going to give you a heads up again. This could be potentially sensitive for some of us here. I'm going to talk about my brother and his battle with cancer. He was my best friend. His name's Andrew. He was my absolute best friend. He's like a father figure to me. We both became Christians at the same time. And he helped me get off drugs, and he was just awesome. Just loved him so much. And cancer is the absolute worst. It started in his liver and then metastasized to his lungs. And it was the lung cancer that ultimately got him. And I don't know why he got cancer. There's no real natural reason. He wasn't a smoker. He was healthy, kids, very athletic, all of those sorts of things. So I don't know why then, and I don't know why now. But I remember asking him after one of his operations, and I said to him, Andrew, man, if you could have something, what's the one thing that you would want the most right now? You're going through the worst sort of suffering that our family has ever gone through. Aside from being cured outright, obviously you want that. But besides that, what is the thing that you want the most when you're going through your suffering? And I'll never forget what he told me. He said, Zoman, the thing that I want the most is to not be alone. Some of us know the power of someone saying, I'm here. I'm here with you. Chadwick Boseman, a few years ago, passed away on the next slide from a very similar sort of cancer. And Her Majesty passed away last year. And you all remember what happened in terms of social media when these two figures passed away. There was a flood, a digital flood of people posting condolences, favorite quotes, favorite pictures, favorite moments, if they got to meet the Queen or something like that. And let me ask you, what were we doing when we were posting such things? Yes, we're showing love, but we were doing something far more fundamental than just showing love in that way. What we were doing, I think, is this. When we were posting, we were showing the grieving families that they were not alone in their pain, that their suffering hadn't gone unnoticed, that we deeply care, that we value them, that they are valuable, and that they are loved. By posting, in a very real sense, we were entering into their suffering and saying, I'm here. And that is exactly what God did when God entered into the world of suffering through the person of Jesus. This is the ultimate answer from the biblical perspective to the question of this lecture, which is Emmanuel, God with us. That is the huge point of the doctrine of the incarnation. God enfleshed amongst our hurt. And just think about what that means for a moment. God enters our world through Jesus. First, we can read in the Gospels how God responds to instances of suffering, evil, and injustice. On the next slide, how God responds to a mom who lost her sons, a pair of sisters who lost their brother, someone rejected by society and religion, those possessed by evil, those contributing to systemic institutional oppression, the sick, the poor, the violent. And so what does God think when he encounters such things, when we read these examples? And he hates it. That's his response. He hates it. And what's more fascinating than that is that God through Jesus Christ, doesn't run away from all of these instances, but runs towards them and meets them with compassion and tears and a redirection towards the good and the just. And you see, it's not enough for God to merely observe these things as he encounters them through the person of Jesus Christ. No, far more than that, the Gospels tell us. God, through Christ, experiences suffering, evil, and injustice. He experienced, on the next slide, what it is like to be a refugee. To experience poverty, hunger, thirst. He experienced societal and religious rejection, personal encounters with evil, psychological, physical, and sexual trauma as they force him to take off his clothes, and he is naked in front of the creation that he clothes. He knows what it's like to feel abandoned by your closest relationships, suffering an unjust trial and publicly tortured and executed. You know, when you're going through pain, it is only the people who have also gone through that pain that can really speak into your life. And it's my view that Jesus has earned the right to speak into every bleeding heart. I'm going to close with a story. I was at that same art exhibit that I was talking about earlier, entitled Beautiful, and we had a gentleman come in. His name was Naweed. And Naweed came in and he wanted to see all of the different pictures, so I was showing him, and I'm not sure if I had this slide. The paintings were absolutely stunning, absolutely stunning. And I'm showing him all of these things, and then we finish on my favorite piece. And my favorite piece is a group of these women together, and they're smiling and laughing. And Naweed asked me, he's like, do these women, do they live in community together or something? I want to understand this picture. And I said, man, I have no idea if they live together in a community, but I'm really curious, why is that something so fascinating to you? And I'll never forget what he said to me. He says, quote, I suspect they do, because it is only those with scars that can possibly understand the scars of others. I suspect that they do, because it is only those with scars that can possibly understand the scars of others. I said, now we come from completely different backgrounds, but at the center of the Christian message is not an unscathed God, but a scarred. I just want to finish by saying that if Jesus only suffered, then his story would only be comfort. The reason why Jesus is the source of hope for Christians around the globe, including these women, is because of the resurrection. For resurrection means that injustice does not have the final word. That even if the men who burned these women in India escape justice now, that they won't escape justice in the end. Because Jesus lives and was not swallowed up by suffering and injustice. We can be certain that victims of injustice will not be either. And in the end, Jesus' promise to every bleeding heart is that he will right every wrong. And our finite suffering, that's very real, very real, our finite suffering will be swamped by infinite joy. Thank you so much. I really look forward to your questions.